The credit card statement slipped from Ray's briefcase when I moved it from the kitchen counter, and as I bent to pick it up, I saw charges for a pediatric dentist in Denver I'd never heard of, soccer league fees for children named Francis and Celine, and grocery bills from a Whole Foods near an address that definitely wasn't ours. 34 years of marriage collapsed around me as I realized my husband had been living an entirely different life every time he told me he was traveling for business to expand his consulting firm's Western operations. I stood there in our kitchen at 7 in the morning, still in my bathrobe, holding this piece of paper that contained evidence of children who apparently needed regular dental care and athletic equipment, children whose names I'd never heard before, children whose lives Ray was financing with our joint credit card. The statement was addressed to our home, to Ray Parker, but every single charge on it related to expenses in Denver, Colorado, where Ray's industrial consulting firm had supposedly been pursuing major contracts for the past 5 years. Ray had left the previous Thursday for another one of his regular business trips to meet with potential clients and secure new accounts, trips that had become increasingly frequent since his company began their Western expansion project. I'd been proud of Ray's professional success, actually, the way his expertise was being recognized and how these new contracts were building our retirement security. When friends commented on how often he traveled for work, I'd explained his growing reputation in the industry and how important these client relationships were for our financial future. But here in my hands was evidence of a 6-year-old named Francis, who played in a soccer league that cost $340 per season, and an 8-year-old named Celine who'd had dental work done 3 times in the past 6 months. Children who lived in Denver. Children whose expenses Ray was paying with our shared financial resources, while telling me every dollar of travel expenses was going toward building his business and securing our retirement. I sat down heavily at our kitchen table, the same table where Ray and I had shared breakfast 3 days earlier before he left for his latest business trip. He'd seemed focused that morning, reviewing his presentation materials and discussing the potential value of the Morrison Industries contract he was hoping to finalize. He'd mentioned that this particular deal could set us up very comfortably for retirement, and we talked about possibly taking that European river cruise we'd been planning once this major project was complete. I'd kissed him goodbye at our front door, wished him luck with his presentations, and promised to keep our home running smoothly while he focused on building our financial future. The same business success that apparently included 2 children I'd never heard of, living in a household I knew nothing about in a city where Ray's business meetings had been taking him for years. The mathematics of deception began organizing themselves in my mind with terrifying clarity. 5 years of monthly business trips to Denver, usually lasting 4 to 7 days each. 5 years of me managing our household alone while Ray built his professional reputation and client base. 5 years of escalating travel expenses that I'd supported as investments in our future, while apparently some unknown portion of our money was going toward children's sports leagues and dental bills and grocery purchases for a family I'd never met. I walked to Ray's home office, still holding the credit card statement, feeling like I was moving through someone else's house. Everything looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. His desk with its neat stacks of business proposals, his computer monitor displaying client presentations, his coffee mug still sitting where he'd left it Thursday morning before heading to the airport for what he'd called the most important business trip of his career. But I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes, like someone had handed me glasses that brought a previously invisible layer of reality into sharp focus. How many times had Ray sat at this desk, managing financial obligations to Francis and Celine, while I believed he was researching potential clients and preparing contract proposals? How many times had he organized his business travel while planning activities and schedules for children whose existence he'd completely hidden from me? Ray's filing system had always been meticulously organized, a habit he'd developed during his 30-year career in industrial consulting before starting his own firm 8 years ago. Each client had their own folder, each project its own section, each year clearly labeled and archived. He'd maintained the same system for managing personal business, tax documents, insurance papers, investment records, medical information, all sorted and labeled with the precision of someone who understood that organization prevented problems. The Denver business folder was thick, much thicker than I would have expected for managing client relationships in one city. I pulled it from the filing cabinet and opened it on Ray's desk, my hands steadier now that I had a specific task, a way to channel the energy that was threatening to overwhelm me. What I found was documentation of a double life so elaborate and carefully maintained that it took my breath away. There were lease agreements for a 3-bedroom house in Denver, signed annually for the past 4 years. Utility bills and cable installation receipts. Auto insurance policies for a minivan I'd never heard of. School enrollment forms for Francis Harrison, age 6, and Celine Harrison, age 8. Soccer league registration papers. piano lesson invoices, dental appointment confirmations, parent-teacher conference scheduling notices, Harrison. They were using Ray's middle name as their last name. But what made it even more shocking was that mixed in with these family documents were actual business papers, real client contracts, legitimate meeting notes, genuine project proposals. Ray hadn't been completely fabricating his business success. He'd been conducting real business in Denver while simultaneously maintaining a secret family there. I kept digging through the folder, my disbelief growing with each document. There were Christmas morning photos of Ray opening presents in a living room I'd never seen, sitting next to a woman I didn't recognize while 2 children climbed over him in pajamas. Birthday party pictures of him cutting cake with kids who looked nothing like our grandchildren. School play programs where he was listed as France's emergency contact and Celine Harrison's approved pickup person. And then I found the business incorporation documents, and everything became even more devastating. Ray had established a second consulting firm in Denver, Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions, listing himself as the principal owner and a woman named Celine Harrison as the business partner and co-owner. The business address was the same as the residential address where Francis and Celine lived. Ray had literally been building a business empire with his secret family while telling me he was just pursuing client contracts for his existing Virginia-based firm. But the most shocking discovery was buried at the bottom of the folder. Life insurance policies Ray had taken out on both children, listing himself as the beneficiary. College savings accounts opened in their names with monthly contributions of $500 each. Health insurance policies covering all 4 family members, Ray, Celine Harrison, Francis Harrison, and little Celine Harrison, with Ray listed as the primary policyholder. And then I found the handwritten letter, folded carefully and tucked into an envelope marked, "For Vincent and Brian, to be opened when they turn 18. Vincent and Brian." There were more children. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands and read Ray's familiar handwriting. "Dear Vincent and Brian, by the time you read this, you'll be old, enough to understand that family relationships can be complicated, and that sometimes adults make choices that seem confusing, but come from a place of love and responsibility. I want you to know that from the moment your mother brought you and your siblings into my life, I've considered myself your father in every way that matters. The legal papers might say stepfather, but in my heart, you are my sons just as surely as Francis is my son and your sister Celine is my daughter. I know it's been difficult having a father who travels frequently for business, who can't be at every soccer game or school concert, who sometimes has to miss important events because of his work responsibilities in Virginia. I want you to understand that those responsibilities include managing my original consulting firm and caring for my first wife, Georgia, who lives in Virginia and has health problems that make it dangerous for her to experience stress or major life changes. This isn't because I'm ashamed of our family or because you're not important to me. It's because Georgia is elderly and fragile, and learning about my life with your mother would cause her medical complications that could be life-threatening. I've built our Denver business specifically to ensure that all 4 of you can attend college without financial stress. Parker Harrison. Industrial Solutions belongs to our family, and when I'm gone, your mother will inherit my share of both businesses. You are provided for, protected, and loved. When you're older, you may wonder why I chose to manage my life this way instead of getting divorced and marrying your mother openly. The answer is that divorce would have destroyed both businesses. My original clients expect continuity and stability, and starting over would have meant losing contracts worth millions of dollars over the years. By maintaining both households and both businesses, I can provide financial security for all 6 of my children. You 4, plus Georgia's adult children, Sarah and Michael, who still rely on the Virginia business for their family financial planning. Every choice I made was about building security for everyone I love, even when those choices required me to live a divided life. Your father always, Ray. I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of betrayal and manipulation. Ray hadn't just hidden a second family from me. He'd created an elaborate business justification for his deception that painted me as a sick invalid whose delicate condition required protection from reality. He'd told Vincent and Brian, who were apparently teenagers, old enough to understand that their father was married to someone else, that I was fragile and elderly, and that learning about their existence could be life-threatening to my health. 66 years old wasn't elderly. My recent physical had shown excellent health for my age. I played tennis twice a week, volunteered at the hospital, managed our household finances, and maintained an active social life. There was nothing about my condition that would make learning about Ray's other family dangerous to my health, unless you counted the shock of discovering that your husband of 34 years had been living a completely fabricated life. But perhaps most devastating was Ray's casual mention of our adult children, Sarah and Michael, still relying on his Virginia business for their financial planning. Sarah was a nurse practitioner with her own family, and Michael was an engineer who'd been financially independent for over a decade. Neither of them had business relationships with Ray's consulting firm, and certainly not the kind of ongoing dependence that would justify his claim that divorce would affect their financial security. Ray had constructed an elaborate mythology to justify his double life, casting himself as the noble provider, sacrificing his personal happiness to protect everyone he loved, when in reality he was a man who'd chosen to deceive everyone he claimed to care about while building a business empire that enriched his secret family. I carefully photographed every document in the folder with my phone, creating a digital record of Ray's secret life that he couldn't deny or minimize. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, understanding that my next steps needed to be strategic rather than emotional. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions actually was, and how much of our marital assets had been used to fund Ray's Denver business venture. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 34 years of marriage. I accessed Ray's business computer without his knowledge. Ray had always been protective of his business files, explaining that client confidentiality requirements meant I shouldn't have access to his work computer or business accounts. I'd respected that boundary, understanding that his consulting work involved proprietary information that legally couldn't be shared with unauthorized people. But boundaries, I was learning, are only meaningful when both people honor them. Ray's password had always been some variation of our anniversary date and my initials, so accessing his computer wasn't technically difficult. What I found there, however, was far more complex and devastating than I'd prepared myself to discover. Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions wasn't just a business Ray had started with his secret family. It was a thriving consulting firm that had been systematically taking clients and contracts away from Ray's original Virginia-based business, the business I'd believed was our primary source of income and retirement security. For the past 3 years, Ray had been gradually transitioning his most valuable clients to the Denver firm, telling them he was expanding operations and offering them better service through his Western office. He'd been using our Virginia business resources, client lists, proprietary methodologies, even office equipment to build the Denver firm that would eventually replace our Virginia operations entirely. The financial records showed that Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions had generated over $1.2 million in revenue during the past 2 years, while Ray's Virginia firm had shown declining income over the same period. Ray had been telling me that business was slow and that we needed to be more conservative with our spending, while actually he'd been diverting our most profitable work to the Denver firm that enriched his secret family. But the most shocking discovery was a business plan document titled Transition Strategy 2024 to 2025, which outlined Ray's intention to close the Virginia firm entirely and move all operations to Denver within the next 18 months. The plan included selling our Virginia house, liquidating our local assets, and having me relocate to Denver where I would supposedly be closer to better medical care for my increasing health problems. Ray had been planning to move me to Denver, where I would discover his secret family and be forced to accept the situation because I'd be financially dependent on the business he'd built with Celine Harrison and medically dependent on the healthcare arrangements he'd already established there. He'd been orchestrating a complete takeover of my life, designed to leave me with no choice but to accept his bigamous arrangement while being grateful for the financial security and medical support he was providing. I sat in Ray's office chair, staring at his computer screen, trying to process the scope of the deception and manipulation I'd uncovered. This wasn't just an affair or even a double life. This was a carefully planned strategy to eliminate my independence and autonomy while making me complicit in my own degradation. Ray had spent years positioning himself to force me into a situation where I'd have to choose between accepting his polygamous family arrangement or facing financial ruin and social isolation in a city where I knew no one except his secret family. I called my daughter Sarah immediately. Sarah is my younger child, 38 years old, with the kind of practical intelligence that comes from working in healthcare, where unclear thinking can have serious consequences. She's always been direct in her communication, preferring honest conversations to polite avoidance, and she has an excellent ability to cut through complex situations to identify the core problems. Mom, you sound upset. What's going on? Sarah, I need you to sit down. I'm about to tell you something that's going to change everything you think you know about your father. I told her everything. I described finding the credit card statement, explained what I'd discovered in Ray's filing system, read her portions of the letter he'd written to Vincent and Brian, and detailed the business records I'd found on his computer. Sarah listened without interrupting. Her medical training keeping her focused on gathering all the information before responding. Jesus Christ, Mom, this is insane. How long has this been going on? At least 5 years, possibly longer. Sarah, there's something else. In his letter to Vincent and Brian, your father claims that you and Michael still depend on his Virginia business financially, and that's part of his justification for maintaining this double life. Is there any truth to that? Absolutely not. Michael and I haven't had any business relationship with Dad's firm since we finished college. We're both completely financially independent. If he told these people that divorcing you would affect our financial security, that's just another lie. I was afraid of that. Mom, what are you going to do? This is so much worse than just having an affair. He's been systematically stealing from your marriage to build a business empire with another family, and he was planning to force you to relocate and accept the situation. The question hung in the air between us. What was I going to do? I thought about Ray's transition strategy, his plan to uproot my entire life and move me to Denver where I'd be isolated and dependent on the business he'd built with his secret family. I thought about Vincent and Brian, teenagers who'd been taught to think of me as a sick old woman whose delicate health required their father to lie to her about fundamental aspects of his life. I thought about 34 years of marriage, of supporting Ray's career decisions and accommodating his travel schedule and believing in the financial future we were building together. And then I thought about Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions, the million-dollar business Ray had built using our marital assets and client relationships, the business that was supposed to become my prison when he forced me to relocate to Denver. I'm going to take his real business away from him, I said. Both of them. What do you mean? I mean, I'm going to hire the best business attorney in Virginia, and I'm going to prove that Ray built his Denver firm using marital assets and stolen business resources, and then I'm going to take ownership of both companies and leave Ray with exactly what he deserves. Nothing. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Mom, do you think you can actually do that legally? Sarah, your father has been using our joint credit cards, our business equipment, our client lists, and our office resources to build a competing firm that he intended to use to force me into accepting bigamy. He's committed fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly racketeering. I'm not just going to divorce him, I'm going to destroy him financially and professionally. That evening, I began the process of reclaiming not just my life, but the business empire Ray had stolen from our marriage to build his fantasy family. I started by calling Patricia Williams, the family law attorney Sarah had recommended, and explaining that I needed someone who specialized in complex business fraud cases involving stolen marital assets. Patricia referred me to her partner, David Chen, who handled business litigation and asset recovery in divorce cases. Mrs. Parker, David said when I met with him the next morning, your situation is extraordinarily complex, but also extraordinarily strong from a legal perspective. If your husband has been using marital assets and business resources to build a competing firm, and if he's been systematically diverting income from your joint business to enrich his other family, you have grounds for both criminal fraud charges and civil asset recovery. David explained the legal strategy in detail. We would file for immediate asset freezing to prevent Ray from transferring any more resources to his Denver operations. We would subpoena financial records for both businesses to trace the movement of marital assets. We would hire forensic accountants to establish the value of the business opportunities and client relationships Ray had stolen from our Virginia firm. Most importantly, David said, we're going to petition the court to award you ownership of both businesses as compensation for your husband's theft of marital assets. You built the Virginia firm together over decades, and he used those resources to create the Denver firm without your knowledge or consent. Both companies should belong to you. What about Celine Harrison? She's listed as the co-owner of the Denver firm. If she can prove she contributed legitimate capital or resources to the business development, she may be entitled to compensation for her investment. But she can't claim ownership of a business that was built using stolen assets, even if she didn't know they were stolen. The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected, partly because the evidence of race fraud was so extensive and well documented, and partly because David was extremely aggressive about protecting our assets, while Ray was still traveling and unaware that his deception had been discovered. Within 48 hours, the court had issued temporary restraining orders, freezing all of Ray's business accounts and preventing him from transferring any assets or signing any new contracts without court approval. Ray's Denver business bank accounts were frozen. His access to our joint credit cards was suspended. His ability to conduct business in either state was temporarily suspended pending the outcome of the fraud investigation. Ray discovered this when he tried to pay for dinner with Vincent and Brian, during his current business trip and found that his credit cards had been declined. He called me from the restaurant, panicked and confused. "Georgia, something's wrong with our credit cards. They're all being declined, and when I called the bank, they said there's some kind of legal hold on our accounts. Do you know anything about this?" I was sitting in my living room, surrounded by legal documents and business records, feeling calmer than I had since this nightmare began. "Ray, I know about Francis and Celine and Vincent and Brian. I know about Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions. I know about your plan to force me to relocate to Denver. And I know about the $1.2 million in marital assets you've stolen to build your business empire with your secret family." The silence on the other end of the phone was complete. "Georgia, I can explain." "No, Ray, you can't explain. There is no explanation for 5 years of systematic theft and fraud that doesn't involve you choosing to betray everything we built together. Georgia, please, let me come home and we can talk about this." "You can't come home, Ray. The court has issued a restraining order preventing you from entering our house or accessing our joint assets pending the outcome of the criminal fraud investigation." "Criminal investigation?" "You used our business resources to build a competing firm. You diverted marital income to support your other family, and you forged business documents to steal our clients. The district attorney is very interested in your business practices." I could hear Ray's breathing getting faster, the panic setting in as he realized the scope of the legal trouble he was facing. "What about my businesses? I have client obligations, contracts I need to fulfill." "Both businesses are now under court supervision, Ray. Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions has been temporarily shut down pending the asset investigation, and your Virginia firm is being managed by a court-appointed administrator until the ownership issues are resolved." "Georgia, you can't destroy my life's work over this. Those businesses support 6 children. Ray, those businesses were built with stolen marital assets. You don't get to keep the profits from fraud just because you use them to support the family you built with your fraud." The conversation ended with Ray begging me to reconsider, to think about the children who would be affected, to remember the 34 years we'd spent building a life together. But I'd already spent 5 days thinking about the children who would be affected, including our own adult children who'd been unknowingly used as justification for their father's fraud. I'd already remembered our 34 years together and realized that at least 5 of those years had been completely fictitious. The legal process took 18 months to complete, during which Ray fought every aspect of the asset recovery while simultaneously trying to negotiate a plea deal with the district attorney to avoid prison time for business fraud. The forensic accounting revealed that Ray had stolen approximately $847,000 in marital assets to fund his Denver operations, including business equipment, client lists, proprietary methodologies, and direct cash transfers. He'd also diverted an additional $400,000 in income from our Virginia business to support his Denver household while claiming to me that business was declining and we needed to reduce our expenses. But the most valuable discovery was that Ray's client relationships, built over decades of work we'd done together, were worth an estimated $3.2 million in projected future revenue. Ray had been systematically transferring these relationships to his Denver firm, effectively stealing our retirement security to build his secret family's financial future. The court's final ruling was more favorable than I dared hope. I was awarded full ownership of both Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions and Ray's original Virginia consulting firm, along with all client contracts, business assets, and intellectual property. Ray was ordered to pay restitution for the stolen marital assets, plus interest and penalties. He was also sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for wire fraud and tax evasion related to his business manipulations. Celine Harrison lost her home when the court determined it had been purchased with stolen marital assets. She also lost her ownership stake in Parker Harrison Industrial Solutions when the forensic accounting proved that her investment had consisted entirely of money Ray had diverted from our Virginia business. Most importantly, I gained control of a business empire worth approximately $4.8 million, built using the client relationships and methodologies Ray and I had developed together over decades, but which he'd tried to steal to support his fantasy family. The irony was perfect. Ray had spent 5 years building a business empire to escape our marriage and support his secret family, and his efforts had resulted in me owning that entire empire while he lost everything. But the real satisfaction came 6 months after the legal proceedings ended, when I received a letter from Vincent, the older of Ray's secret stepsons. "Mrs. Parker," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that Francis and Celine and Brian and I understand now that our dad lied to all of us, not just you. We thought you were a sick old lady who couldn't handle the truth about our family, But we found out that you're actually younger than our mom, and that you've been working to support our college funds for years without knowing we existed. We also found out that our dad was planning to force you to move to Denver and live with our family without asking if you wanted that, which seems really mean and scary. We're sorry that our family cost you so much money and trouble. We hope you're doing okay now that you don't have to deal with our dad's lies anymore. The letter was signed by all 4 children, Vincent, Brian, Francis, and little Celine, and included hand-drawn pictures they'd made showing me as a businesswoman in a suit rather than the sick old lady Ray had described to them. I wrote back, explaining that they weren't responsible for the choices their stepfather had made, and that I hoped they would remember that adults who truly love children don't build their relationships on lies and stolen money. 2 years after Ray's conviction, I sold both businesses to a larger consulting firm for $6.2 million, keeping only the client relationships I wanted to maintain on a part-time basis. The money, combined with the restitution Ray was required to pay, left me with more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible. But more importantly, it left me with the satisfaction of knowing that Ray's elaborate plan to force me into accepting his bigamous lifestyle had resulted in him losing everything while I gained the independence and resources to build whatever life I chose. I used part of the money to establish college funds for Vincent, Brian, Francis, and little Celine. Not because I felt obligated to support Ray's secret family, but because those children had been innocent, victims of his deception, and they deserved educational opportunities that weren't built on fraud and lies. I also used the money to purchase a beautiful house in the mountains of North Carolina, where I'd always wanted to live but had never suggested during my marriage to Ray because he'd claimed his business required us to stay in Virginia. Most surprisingly, I used some of the money to start my own consulting firm, focusing on helping small businesses develop ethical practices and transparent financial management. It turns out that 34 years of managing a household and supporting Ray's career had given me excellent business skills that I'd never had the opportunity to develop independently. My new business, Integrity Solutions, has become surprisingly successful, partly because my experience with Ray's fraud made me exceptionally good at identifying and preventing the kind of financial manipulation that destroys businesses and families. I've also started dating again, which surprises everyone, including myself. His name is Vincent, which caused some amusing confusion initially, given the name of one of Ray's stepsons, and he's a widower I met at a business networking event. Vincent is 70 years old, retired from a career in banking, and has the refreshing quality of being exactly who he appears to be. Vincent knows the entire story of my marriage to Ray, and his response was both validating and healing. "The man was an idiot," he said simply. "He had a woman of intelligence and character who supported his every decision for 34 years, and he threw that away to build a life based on lies and fraud. What kind of foundation is that for any relationship?" Vincent's perspective helped me understand something important about Ray's behavior that I'd been struggling to comprehend. Ray hadn't just betrayed me, he'd also betrayed Celine and her children by building their relationship on a foundation of deception and stolen assets. When Francis and little Celine and Vincent and Brian called him Dad, they were calling him by a name that belonged to fraud. When Celine planned her future around their business partnership, she was planning around someone who'd built that business with stolen money and stolen client relationships. The man who'd presented himself to them as a successful businessman planning to marry their mother was as much a fiction as the man who had presented himself to me as a faithful husband building our retirement security. Ray had created elaborate personas to manage both relationships, and neither family had ever met the real Ray Parker, a man so committed to avoiding difficult choices that he'd chosen to commit federal crimes rather than have honest conversations about what he wanted his life to look like. I learned through my attorney that Celine had eventually lost her house and been forced to move herself and the 4 children in with her parents in Utah. The children had apparently been devastated by the loss of the man they'd considered their father and by the revelation that their college funds had been built with stolen money. Ray's choices hadn't just destroyed his marriage to me, they'd destroyed his relationship with 4 children who'd had no part in creating the situation they found themselves in, and they'd left Celine financially ruined and socially humiliated in the community where she'd built her life. That might have been the most tragic consequence of his deception, that 6 people who'd loved and trusted him had suffered real losses because of his inability to live authentically. I also learned that Ray had been released from federal prison after serving 14 months of his sentence, and that he was living in a halfway house in Denver while working at a fast food restaurant to pay his court-ordered restitution. His business reputation had been destroyed by the fraud conviction, making it impossible for him to work in consulting or any field requiring client trust. The man who'd once managed million-dollar projects was now earning minimum wage and sleeping in a shared room, having lost his marriage, his businesses, his professional reputation, and his relationship with the 6 children he'd claimed to love. Sometimes I wonder if Ray ever thinks about the choices that led him to that halfway house, or if he's learned anything about the cost of building a life on lies and fraud. But mostly, I try not to waste energy thinking about Ray at all. These days, I'm focused on building a life that belongs entirely to me, running my business, enjoying my relationship with Vincent, maintaining close connections with my children and grandchildren, and pursuing interests and activities that bring me genuine satisfaction. Last month, Vincent and I took a cruise to Alaska, something I'd wanted to do for years, but had never felt comfortable suggesting during my marriage to Ray, because he'd always seemed to have other priorities for our vacation budget. It was magnificent. The glaciers and wildlife and scenery exceeded every expectation, and sharing those experiences with someone who wanted to include me in his adventures was profoundly healing. Planning that trip together felt like a perfect example of what a partnership should look like. 2 people with individual interests and preferences working together to create experiences they'll both enjoy, making decisions based on honest communication about their desires and resources. It's such a contrast to the years I spent accommodating Ray's mysterious travel schedule and unexplained budget constraints, never quite understanding why our plans always seemed to revolve around limitations he couldn't or wouldn't explain. Sometimes I marvel at how different my life looks now compared to 4 years ago, when I was still married to Ray and still believing that I was in a partnership based on mutual honesty and shared goals. I was so focused on being a good wife, on supporting Ray's decisions and accommodating his needs, that I'd lost sight of what I needed and deserved from a relationship. If I could speak to my younger self, the woman who spent decades accommodating and rationalizing Ray's increasingly suspicious behavior, I would tell her to trust her instincts, ask hard questions, and never apologize for expecting honesty from the people who claim to love her. But I can't change the past, so instead, I try to model those principles for the younger women in my life. My daughter Sarah, my granddaughters, the clients I work with who are building their own businesses. I tell them that being a good partner doesn't mean accepting treatment that makes you feel confused or uncertain or unvalued. I tell them that love without honesty isn't really love at all, and that anyone who asks you to ignore your instincts or dismiss your concerns is asking you to participate in your own mistreatment. Most importantly, I tell them that it's never too late to choose yourself, to walk away from situations that diminish your dignity, and to build a life that reflects your own values and priorities. I learned that lesson at 66, but I'm grateful I learned it at all. Some people spend their entire lives accommodating dishonesty and never discover what authentic partnership feels like. 4 years ago, I thought my marriage to Ray was the foundation of my identity and security. I thought ending it would mean losing everything that mattered about my life. Instead, ending that marriage meant losing only the things that were built on lies and keeping everything that was genuinely mine: my children and grandchildren, my friendships, my values, my intelligence, my capacity for love and growth, and my ability to build financial security through my own efforts. And it meant gaining things I hadn't even known I was missing: peace of mind, professional fulfillment, romantic partnership based on respect and honesty, and most importantly, confidence in my own judgment and worth. At 70, I'm healthier, happier, and more optimistic about the future than I've been in decades. I wake up each morning knowing that the day ahead will be spent with people who value honesty, in activities that bring me joy, making decisions that reflect my own priorities and preferences. I also wake up knowing that I own a successful business built on helping other people avoid the kind of financial fraud and manipulation that Ray used against me. Every client I help protect their assets and establish transparent business practices is a small victory against the kind of deception that nearly destroyed my life. That's what I gained when I finally stopped accommodating fraud and started fighting back strategically. That's what I gained when I chose to trust my instincts over my fears. That's what I gained when I decided I deserved better than a marriage built on lies and theft. And every day since then has been proof that I made the right choice. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't just living well. It's taking everything your betrayer tried to steal from you and using it to build a life so much better than anything they could have given you that their deception becomes the greatest gift they ever inadvertently provided. But the story doesn't end there, because Ray's conviction and imprisonment had consequences that rippled through both of our families in ways I never could have anticipated. About 6 months after Ray was released from federal prison, I received an unexpected phone call from Celine herself. She tracked down my number through the court records, and her voice was shaky when she introduced herself. "Mrs. Parker, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to call you because there are things you should know about what Ray told us about you, and things I think you should know about what really happened with our family." I was sitting in my home office in North Carolina reviewing contracts for my consulting business, and I'll admit that hearing from the woman who'd been Ray's other wife for 5 years was jarring. But there was something in her voice, a combination of exhaustion and desperation, that made me willing to listen. "I understand if you hate me," Celine continued, "but I want you to know that everything Ray told me about you was a lie. He said you were severely mentally ill, that you'd had multiple nervous breakdowns, and that you were so unstable that any stress could cause you to become suicidal. He said your doctors had specifically warned him that learning about our relationship could trigger a psychotic episode that might require hospitalization." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar surge of anger at Ray's manipulation. Even in explaining his betrayal to his other family, he'd continued to diminish and pathologize me. "He also told me that you were the one who owned the Virginia business," Celine continued, "and that he was essentially working for you because you controlled all the family finances due to an inheritance from your father. He said that leaving you would mean losing access to the business and the client relationships, which would leave him unable to support our family." This was a new level of deception that I hadn't previously understood. Ray hadn't just lied about my health and mental state, he'd also reversed our actual financial relationship, portraying himself as the dependent spouse rather than the controlling partner. "Celine," I said carefully, "I want you to know that none of that was true. I'm not mentally ill, I've never had a nervous breakdown, and I built that business alongside Ray over 30 years of marriage. He was the one who controlled our finances, not me." "I know that now," she said, and I could hear her crying. "When the FBI interviewed me during the fraud investigation, they showed me documents proving that Ray was the sole owner of the Virginia business, and that he'd been transferring assets to our Denver firm without your knowledge. That's when I realized that everything he'd told me about your marriage was fabricated." We talked for almost 2 hours, and what emerged was a picture of Ray's deception that was even more elaborate and cruel than I'd realized. He'd convinced Celine that I was not only mentally unstable, but also financially controlling and emotionally abusive toward him. He'd portrayed himself as trapped in a marriage with a woman who threatened suicide whenever he tried to establish any independence. "He showed me fake medical records," Celine said. "Documents that looked like they came from your doctor describing your psychiatric medications and your history of self-harm attempts. He said your therapist had told him that his leaving would almost certainly result in your death, and that he couldn't live with that responsibility. Celine, I've never been on psychiatric medication, and I've never attempted self-harm. Those documents were completely fabricated." "I know. The FBI confirmed that during their investigation. Mrs. Parker, I spent 5 years feeling sorry for Ray because I thought he was sacrificing his happiness to keep his mentally ill wife alive. I encouraged him to stay married to you because I thought leaving would literally kill you." The scope of Ray's manipulation was breathtaking. He'd convinced his second family that they were performing an act of mercy by helping him maintain his marriage to me, when in reality they were helping him commit fraud and bigamy. "There's something else," Colleen said. "Ray told Vincent and Brian that when you finally died, which he said would probably happen within a few years because of your mental health problems, he would inherit everything and be able to marry me openly and adopt all 4 children legally. He was essentially waiting for you to kill yourself so he could move on with his real family." I sat in silence for a moment, processing the cruelty of what Celine had revealed. Ray hadn't just been living a double life, he'd been actively hoping for my death so he could consolidate his deception into a single, profitable reality. "The kids were devastated when they learned the truth," Celine continued, "especially Vincent and Brian, who are old enough to understand that they spent years wishing for the death of an innocent woman based on their stepfather's lies. They've been in therapy trying to process the guilt of hoping that someone they'd never met would die so their family could be legitimate." The conversation with Celine changed my understanding of Ray's betrayal in fundamental ways. I'd thought he was simply a coward who couldn't choose between 2 families. But the reality was much darker. He was a man who'd systematically programmed his second family to hate and fear me based on elaborate lies, while simultaneously counting on my eventual death to solve his bigamy problem. That phone call also led to an unexpected relationship with Celine and her children, who had become in many ways as much victims of Ray's deception as I had been. Over the following months, Celine and I developed a correspondence that helped both of us process the scope of what Ray had done to our families. She sent me photos that Ray had taken of the fake medical documents he'd shown her, which my attorney used to file additional fraud charges that extended Ray's prison sentence by another 8 months. More importantly, Celine helped me understand how Ray had been able to sustain his deception for so many years. He'd created completely different versions of reality for each family, with each version designed to make the people in that reality feel sorry for him and protective of his supposed sacrifices. To me, he'd presented himself as the devoted husband whose business success was being threatened by the increasing demands of caring for his elderly, dementia-stricken mother. To Celine's family, he'd presented himself as the trapped husband whose mentally ill wife's threats of suicide prevented him from pursuing his own happiness. Both versions cast Ray as the noble victim of the circumstances beyond his control, which made it easier for both families to accommodate his unusual schedule and unexplained absences. "I think what bothers me most," Celine wrote in one of her letters, "is that he taught my children to hate you without ever giving you a chance to defend yourself." Vincent spent 3 years writing school reports about the dangers of mental illness, using you as an example of someone whose problems hurt innocent family members. Brian drew pictures of you as a monster who was keeping his dad away from his real family. The idea that Ray had turned children against me, based on fabricated mental health records, was particularly painful because it revealed how he'd weaponized stigma and fear to maintain his deception. But it also created an opportunity for healing that I hadn't expected. With Celine's permission, I began corresponding directly with Vincent and Brian, who were now 16 and 14 respectively, old enough to understand the complexity of what their stepfather had done, and mature enough to process their own feelings of guilt and confusion. "Mrs. Parker," Vincent wrote in his first letter to me, "I want you to know that Brian and I understand now that Dad lied to us about everything, including about you. We're sorry we spent so many years thinking bad things about you when you were actually the one being hurt the most. We also want you to know," Brian added in his own letter, "that we're glad you took Dad's businesses away from him, because now we understand that he built those businesses by stealing from you. We think what you did was brave and smart, and we hope you're happy now that you don't have to deal with his lies anymore." The correspondence with Vincent and Brian evolved into a genuine relationship that has become one of the unexpected blessings of this entire ordeal. Both boys are intelligent and thoughtful, and their perspective on Ray's deception has helped me understand aspects of his personality that I'd missed during our marriage. "Dad was always really good at making people feel sorry for him," Vincent wrote in one letter. "Whenever he got in trouble for anything, he could always explain why it wasn't really his fault and why the people who were mad at him should actually feel bad for him instead. I think that's how he was able to lie to so many people for so long. He made everyone feel like they were helping him instead of being hurt by him." Vincent's insight was remarkably mature for a 16-year-old, and it helped me understand why I'd been so slow to recognize Ray's deception. He'd been exceptionally skilled at presenting his lies as sacrifices he was making for other people's benefit. When Ray told me he needed to travel frequently to care for his mother, he'd presented it as a burden he was reluctantly accepting out of family duty. When he told Celine he couldn't leave his mentally ill wife, he'd presented it as a moral obligation he was reluctantly accepting out of compassion. In both cases, he'd positioned himself as the selfless hero rather than the selfish deceiver. The relationship with Vincent and Brian also led to my involvement in their education and future planning in ways that felt healing for all of us. When I learned that the college funds Ray had established for them had been depleted during the asset recovery process, I made the decision to reestablish those funds using money from the sale of the businesses Ray had built with stolen assets. It seemed appropriate that his fraud should ultimately benefit the children who'd been manipulated into supporting it. "You don't have to do this," Celine wrote when I told her about the college funds. "You don't owe us anything, and you've already been hurt enough by our family." "I'm not doing it because I owe you anything," I replied. "I'm doing it because Vincent and Brian are good kids who deserve educational opportunities that aren't tainted by their stepfather's crimes. They didn't choose to be part of Ray's deception, and they shouldn't be punished for his choices." Establishing those college funds also gave me a sense of closure about the money Ray had stolen. Instead of letting his fraud create only destruction and loss, I was able to transform it into something that would benefit innocent people and create positive outcomes. Vincent is now a sophomore at Colorado State University, studying business ethics with the intention of becoming a corporate compliance officer, a career choice that seems directly influenced by his experience with Ray's fraud. Brian is a senior in high school, planning to study social work because he wants to help families dealing with deception and manipulation. Both boys have chosen careers focused on preventing the kind of harm their stepfather inflicted, which I find both inspiring and redemptive. Meanwhile, my relationship with Vincent, my romantic partner, not the teenager, has continued to develop in ways that demonstrate what authentic partnership looks like when both people prioritize honesty and mutual respect. Last year, Vincent and I decided to combine our resources and purchase a larger house together, a decision we made after months of open discussion about our individual financial situations, our long-term goals, and our expectations for the relationship. The entire process was a stark contrast to my marriage with Ray, where financial decisions were made through manipulation and deception rather than collaboration and transparency. "I want you to see all of my financial records," Vincent told me early in our discussions about buying property together. "I want you to understand exactly what I'm bringing to this partnership, and I want to make sure you're comfortable with how we structure our shared expenses and individual responsibilities." Vincent's willingness to be completely transparent about his finances, his debts, his income, and his long-term financial planning was profoundly healing after decades of being kept in the dark about Ray's true financial activities. We spent weeks reviewing each other's investment portfolios, insurance policies, estate planning documents, and business obligations. We discussed our individual relationships with our adult children and how those relationships might affect our shared financial planning. We even reviewed each other's credit reports and medical histories, ensuring that we were making decisions based on complete and accurate information. The process felt like an antidote to everything Ray had done wrong during our marriage. Instead of secrets and lies, there was transparency and honesty. Instead of unilateral decisions disguised as joint planning, there was genuine collaboration. Instead of manipulation and emotional pressure, there was patience and respect for each other's need to think carefully about major decisions. When we finally purchased our house together, a beautiful contemporary home with mountain views and space for both of our home offices, it felt like a celebration of what relationships can accomplish when both people prioritize truth and mutual respect. The house also became a symbol of how completely my life had been transformed by Ray's betrayal and my response to it. 4 years earlier, I'd been living in a house that Ray was secretly planning to sell so he could force me to relocate to Denver and accept his bigamous lifestyle. Now I was living in a house I'd chosen freely, purchased with money I'd earned through my own business success, sharing it with a partner who respected my autonomy and valued my intelligence. My consulting business, Integrity Solutions, has also grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started it, as a way to channel my experience with Ray's fraud into helping other people. What began as a small firm focused on helping businesses establish transparent financial practices has evolved into a comprehensive consulting company that specializes in fraud prevention, business ethics training, and organizational integrity assessment. I now employ 6 full-time consultants and work with clients ranging from small family businesses to major corporations. The irony isn't lost on me that Ray's elaborate business fraud ultimately led to my developing expertise that has made me more financially successful than our original business ever was. His betrayal forced me to learn about forensic accounting, business law, fraud detection, and organizational psychology, skills that have made me exceptionally good at helping other people protect themselves from the kind of manipulation Ray used against me. Last month, I was invited to speak at a national conference on business ethics, presenting a case study about how personal relationships can be weaponized to facilitate corporate fraud. My presentation focused on Ray's use of our marriage to access and steal business resources, and how his emotional manipulation prevented me from recognizing the warning signs of his financial crimes. The most sophisticated fraud isn't necessarily the most technologically complex, I told the audience. It's the fraud that exploits trust and emotional connection to prevent victims from asking the questions that would expose the deception. The presentation was well received, and I've since been invited to consult with several organizations that are developing training programs to help employees recognize and report financial manipulation. It's gratifying to know that my experience with Ray's betrayal is being used to help other people avoid similar victimization, and that his fraud has ultimately contributed to improving business practices and protecting other families from financial predators. I've also been contacted by several attorneys who represent clients in complex fraud cases, asking me to serve as an expert witness in cases involving business fraud facilitated by personal relationships. My experience with Ray's deception, combined with my professional expertise in business integrity, has apparently made me valuable in helping courts understand how emotional manipulation can be used to enable financial crimes. Each time I testify in one of these cases, I feel like I'm getting a small piece of justice not just for myself, but for all the other people who've been betrayed by someone they trusted. The most satisfying case involved a woman whose husband had been using their joint business to fund a gambling addiction, telling her that their declining profits were due to increased competition when actually he was diverting business income to cover his gambling debts. My testimony helped establish that his lies constituted fraud rather than just marital deception, which allowed her to recover assets that would otherwise have been considered joint marital debt. Thank you for showing me that I didn't have to accept being financially destroyed by someone who claimed to love me, she wrote to me after her case was resolved. Your story gave me the courage to fight back instead of just trying to survive. Letters like that remind me why Ray's betrayal, as painful as it was, ultimately became one of the most empowering experiences of my life. It forced me to discover strengths and capabilities I didn't know I possessed, and it showed me that I could not only survive deception and fraud, but use that experience to build something meaningful and valuable. At 71, I'm running a successful business, enjoying a relationship based on mutual respect and honesty, maintaining strong connections with my children and grandchildren, and using my experience to help other people protect themselves from financial predators and manipulative partners. I'm also serving as an informal mentor to Celine, who has started her own small business providing administrative services to medical practices. Her experience with Ray's fraud has made her exceptionally careful about business relationships and financial transparency, qualities that have made her business successful and trustworthy. I learned from watching what Ray did to both of us, she told me recently, that the most important thing in any business relationship is making sure everyone has access to the same accurate information. No secrets, no surprises, no manipulation. Celine's business philosophy is a direct response to Ray's deception, and watching her build something honest and sustainable feels like another form of justice. Sometimes people ask me if I ever feel sad about the end of my marriage to Ray, or if I regret the way I handled his betrayal. The answer is that what I feel sad about is the time I lost believing in something that wasn't real. And the only thing I regret is not trusting my instincts sooner. But I don't regret divorcing Ray, and I don't regret fighting to recover the assets he stole, and I certainly don't regret using my experience to build a better life and help other people protect themselves from similar betrayal. Every aspect of my current life is better than the corresponding aspect of my marriage to Ray, my financial security, my professional fulfillment, my romantic relationship, my family connections, my sense of purpose, my confidence in my own judgment. The only thing I lost in the divorce was the illusion that I had a partner who shared my values and was committed to building a life together based on honesty and mutual respect. And losing that illusion turned out to be the most liberating experience of my adult life. Ray's deception taught me that it's never too late to choose yourself, to walk away from situations that diminish your dignity, and to build a life that reflects your own values and priorities. It taught me that being accommodating and supportive doesn't mean accepting treatment that makes you feel confused or uncertain or unvalued. Most importantly, it taught me that the best response to betrayal isn't just survival, it's transformation. Ray tried to steal my financial security, my business relationships, and my autonomy. Instead, his betrayal forced me to develop skills and discover strengths that have made me more financially secure, professionally successful, and personally empowered than I ever was during our marriage. That's what I gained when I finally stopped accommodating fraud and started fighting back strategically. That's what I gained when I chose to trust my instincts over my fears. That's what I gained when I decided I deserved better than a marriage built on lies and theft. And every day since then has been proof that the best revenge isn't just living well, it's using your betrayer's own weapons against them and building a life so much better than anything they could have given you that their deception becomes the foundation of your greatest success.